So that was the classic Sonic games, huh? Hey, what are you doing? I finished Sonic 3 and Knuckles just now, and let me tell you, these classic Sonic games are something else. So you finally played them, huh? I guess it's not too long until you become a Sonic fan. Nope, that's still not gonna happen, but I will say, these games were not what I expected. Care to elaborate? Well, for the time they came out in, I could see this being all the rage, but that makes me wonder, why do people nowadays not think of these games when they think of classic games? I mean, it depends on who you ask. Well, that is true, but at the same time I could kind of understand why some of these games couldn't be thought of fondly. What? Yeah, in fact, now that I think about it, were these games even good to begin with? Starting off with the very first Sonic game, Sonic the Hedgehog first came out in 1991 for the Sega Mega Drive. I'm not going to bore you with the development of this game and stuff since there are other games I have to go through, but the most interesting things I learned about this game's development was it was a huge mess with a bunch of problems between Japan and America's Sega divisions. I'm exaggerating a little, but for the most part that is true. It took about a year to be developed, and I guess Sonic was also meant to be a rabbit apparently. Whatever the case, the main point of all this was Sega wanted a new mascot and Sonic was the one who ended up coming out of it. You didn't even mention that fact once though. Well, I'm sorry that I don't normally host these videos about games. Moving on to gameplay, this game is a lot more fast paced than Mario. At the same time though, somehow it feels somewhat slower. Let's take a step back before I get into that though. For the first Sonic game, it has everything you would expect from a 2D Sonic game. Moving horizontally, jumping, and spin dashing. However, it felt like this game was very stiff to control. I don't know if it's because the version I played, being the Sonic Origins version, or because the game was built like that, but somehow, it feels harder to control than the first Mario game, as in Super Mario Bros. Enemies vary in difficulty, with every level introducing a new enemy to look out for. However, randomly, the spike in difficulty with the enemies you deal with is actually unexpected. But the good thing about enemies is most of them are defeated by jumping on them, but some are better defeated by spin dashing to them. The reason I say it's good is it gives you a reason to use the spin dash rather than just trying to build up speed quickly. But for the general way the game plays, that's basically it. Levels feel like puzzles, with there being multiple ways to reach the end of a level. This is pretty typical for 2D Sonic, but I'm just saying that because it's been there since the very beginning. In terms of how each zone feels to play through, the only good zone is, get this, the first zone, Green Hill Zone. Although almost every zone is unique, the pacing of the game heavily tanks by the second zone of the game. This is where the game actually feels like a puzzle, because now you aren't going through an open area. Somehow, all zones after the first become a lot more closed, and as a result, the levels feel harder to traverse through. I know a lot of people hate Labyrinth Zone, but in reality, almost every zone feels like that zone without the water. I guess Spring Yard Zone and Starlight Zone are pretty decent zones, but their issue is mainly the random enemies that make the level a little slower to go through. The setting in each zone are pretty cool though, very unique to what you would have seen at the time. Water levels really suck since you move much slower, and you have to worry about oxygen too, so that slows the level down even more. Every zone is 3 acts, or levels depending on how much you understand Sonic terminology, with the last act having a boss. Bosses are pretty simple, with you needing to hit it a couple of times and it dies. Nothing really crazy, but that's basically how levels would go. One thing that actually makes this game really annoying to play are those special zones. You have to have at least 50 rings, and when you get to the end of a level, you have to jump into a giant ring. Yes, you can miss the ring. Then you get into the special zone, and I'm pretty sure this isn't an opinion, but a fact that this is hands down the worst special zone of all Sonic games. You'd have to traverse this maze looking map, and the only thing you can really do is jump. You're going to be in this ball-like state, and the main goal is to get a Chaos Emerald by destroying the blocks around them and touching it. However, the map constantly spins, and there are ways to make it spin slower or faster and change the direction it spins. At the same time, you're trying to avoid these goal thingies that end the level earlier before you get a chance to grab the emerald. The good news is there are only 6 emeralds you have to get in this game. The bad news is that there are 6 of these levels. Whatever the case, if you want to get the good ending of this game, getting all 6 emeralds is the only requirement. You don't even get supersonic for doing this, and you have to get all of them before the last zone of the game, because the giant ring won't spawn in that zone. Since I'm going over more than one game, I'll keep the story segment pretty quick. So the story goes, there are 6 emeralds in South Island, the place the game is set in. Dr. Eggman decides to get them all to make a weapon of destruction using them. By the way, for those who don't know, his name was never Robotnik. That was just a thing the localization team did for the English version. But I guess now it's a general thing being in both the English and Japanese versions. While going through the island, Eggman decides to capture animals and put them into his robots, which is why you see tiny animals jumping out after defeating an enemy. Sonic is for whatever reason Eggman's nemesis. No real reason given as to why, but he goes through the zones getting as many Chaos Emeralds before Eggman, and eventually getting to him in Scrap Brain Zone. Over there, Sonic fights Eggman one last time and saves South Island as a result. Honestly, a pretty nice story, not really revolving around a damsel in distress, but rather just a hedgehog helping nature. In terms of music, from the very first game, this was a strong point. Every zone's music sounding really enjoyable while traversing the annoying level design. My favorite has to be Starlight Zone. Even though the zone is near the end of the game, it feels like the final zone because of the music. It sounds like you've finally gone through all the hardships and are almost at the end. Somewhat of a sense of accomplishment. The person in charge of the music for this game is a J-pop musician named Masato Nakamura. And you'd see Sega continuing to go this route of having band or pop musicians making the music of their games continuing forward. Technically, they still do that with Crossworlds having some bands and musicians making some of the songs. And maybe the next Sonic game will have some crazy music because Sega randomly invited The Weeknd pretty recently. But that's basically Sonic 1, so moving on to Sonic CD. Hey, I wasn't planning on interrupting you like this, but can I talk about Sonic CD instead? Okay, go ahead. No, I mean in another video. What? Why? Well, there's a lot I want to talk about for that game, but I'd rather not make this video longer than it will be. I mean, alright, I guess I'll move on to Sonic 2 instead. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 came out about a year after the first game, in November 1992. Because of the success of the first game, Sega actually thought they had a chance competing against Nintendo, and although nowadays that sounds hysterical, in the past, that was pretty true. If it weren't for the classic games, Sonic really would have been a pretty bad series if it were to come out today. Maybe. But all you need to know is Sega used to have an institute in the US, and that was where Sonic 2 was developed. And also that Yuji Naka quit Sega of Japan and went to Sega's American Institute for a higher pay. And the fact that Sega of Japan told the American team that they didn't need a game, which they ended up taking back and saying work on Sonic 2 a couple of months later, which ended up giving the development a very small time frame, at least compared to how long they would have wanted to work on the game. For the most part, this game is a better version of Sonic the Hedgehog. The first thing I noticed was the game felt a lot easier to control, feeling pretty responsive compared to the first game. Again, I don't really know if that was a Sonic Origins thing though. However, there were 2 big things added in this game, the first being Tails' debut in Sonic. I know there will be someone out there wanting to say his first debut was actually the 8-bit version of Sonic 2. He does actually change up the way the game plays with his flying ability. Most of the movement in the Sonic series is horizontal, so with a character that has a strong vertical mobility, it makes exploring levels vertically a lot easier. The second big change comes after getting all 7 Chaos Emeralds. Yes, this game is the first to have 7 Chaos Emeralds instead of Sonic 1's 6. Once you get all of them, you get access to Super Sonic. Once you have 50 rings, you can transform to him by jumping and pressing whatever button transform him because for whatever reason, it's never consistent depending on the version you play. Super Sonic is much faster than his normal form. You're invincible to anything that can hurt you, but every second you lose 1 ring, his air mobility is so sped up. so if you jump while running, you'll go really fast. So be careful about that. Levels in this game are a little faster paced than the first game. In fact, I thought they were really easy compared to the other games. You get so many lives in this game, and the levels are pretty straightforward. Sure, there are puzzles here and there within the levels, but for the most part, you're just going from point A to point B. However, I think this game's zones are much cooler looking than Sonic 1's. They all feel pretty unique, with very beautifully detailed sprites to make them look more lively. It's pretty impressive this game was only made in less than a year. Funnily enough though, this game has some of my least favorite zones in all of Sonic, like Oil Ocean or Wing Fortress. But for the most part, the game is a lot more fun to play through, and I didn't feel like zones slowed you down too much. You only have to do 2 acts for most zones, but the levels are a bit bigger than the first games. This time, the special zones are accessible after you get 50 rings and hit a checkpoint. You'll have a ring appear above a checkpoint where, when you jump in it, you'll go to the special zone. This game's special zone is probably one of my favorite in all of Sonic. You have 3 stages in each special zone level where you have to get a certain amount of rings to move on to the next stage. Once you do all 3 stages, you can get a Chaos Emerald. This one's really fun, but it gets really hard after the first couple of Chaos Emeralds. And the worst thing about this special zone is if you're playing a Sonic and Tails file, Tails can also get some rings. And the reason that's bad is because Tails follows you a bit after you move, basically leaving him vulnerable to hazards. Bosses in this game are a bit more creative than the first game. They're a lot more fitting to the theme of the levels. For example, in Mystic Cave Zone, you fight Eggman who's using the Egg Digger. They never felt very hard, especially after you get all Chaos Emeralds. That is, until you get to the last boss. This is hands down the hardest Sonic boss I've ever faced. Not only does the game not give you a single ring for backup, there are 2 phases to this boss fight, meaning you can't get hit a single time the entire fight. So unless you learn the patterns and can counterplay, you'll be stuck here. And I'm pretty sure in the original version, once you lose all lives, you have to start the game all over again. Or maybe that was just a Sonic 1 thing. The point is, this game's final boss is so hard. However, just like the last game, you need all Chaos Emeralds to get the good ending. So imagine if you were a kid playing this game, getting to the final boss, somehow beating it, and the game tells you to try again. Yeesh. The story is a little more in depth than Sonic 1. In the island this game takes place, this time being West Side Island, there were 7 stones that ended an ancient civilization because they used it for something other than their initial use of prosperity. Sonic just so happened to go to this island, but he didn't know that he was being followed by Eggman. There, Sonic meets Tails, who idolizes Sonic and follows him through the journey. I guess that explains why the default option when starting a new game is Sonic and Tails. At some point, Sonic learns that Eggman was at the island and made it his goal to stop him. Eggman plans to use the emeralds for his Death Egg space station. Eventually, you guys catch up to him at the Wing Fortress. When you defeat Eggman there, he retreats to his spaceship, where Sonic follows him. Sonic ends up in Death Egg, where he fights against Mecha Sonic, a pretty much prototype version of Metal Sonic. And after he defeats it, you face off against Eggman one last time in his Death Egg robot. Once that's all said and done, the Death Egg station blows up and that's the end of that. More or less the same story with a bit more lore to the Chaos Emeralds. In terms of the music, this game's music is a lot more jamming than the first game. The liveliness I talked about earlier is definitely assisted by the soundtrack. Starting this game with Emerald Hill's song is so much better than with Green Hill's. I guess Green Hill does have points with its iconicness. My favorite for this game is probably Emerald Hill Zone's theme, but Metropolis Zone is a close second. Don't get me wrong though, a lot of this game's soundtrack is much better than the first game's. This game's music was also done by Masato Nakamura, but this would be his last Sonic game he would work on since after this, Sega decided to drop him in favor for another pop star that would later potentially be one of the worst decisions they ended up making for the next game. And that's all I really have for Sonic 2. The last game for today is Sonic the Hedgehog 3, and this game first came out in February 1994. This game was developed by Sega Technical Institute, but was basically the last big Sonic game developed by that team before becoming defunct. I'm not really going to go through the history for this game since it's longer than the other two, but just know, because of Sonic's success, Sega was going wild with releases of Sonic games, and this game basically started development about a year after Sonic 2. Also that the and Knuckles version came out in October 1994. This game blew me away when I first started playing it. Whether it's the visuals or the gameplay, this game was genuinely breathtaking. And saying that to an over 30-year-old game is something else. It now makes me wonder if I would have had the same reaction without playing each game back to back. Just like the last game, this game felt very responsive. Now, if you press jump mid-air, Sonic will do a move called Insta-Shield. It protects Sonic from getting hit by enemies that may be dangerous to jump on top of. It also expands the hitbox of his attack range, I think. In this game, there are multiple types of shields you can get. This is the first time the fire, bubble, and electric shields were included in a Sonic game. When you have one of these shields, instead of an insta-shield, Sonic will do whatever ability the shield allows him to do. In this game, Knuckles also makes his debut. Although he wasn't playable in Sonic 3, he was playable in the and Knuckles expansion. He's a bit slower than Sonic, mainly using his abilities for mobility. He can glide and climb walls, which makes him good for overall exploration. He also has special versions of levels that differ from Sonic and Tails' version. Levels in this game are a bit similar to Sonic 2, only being 2 acts long per zone, but that's where the similarities end. Because this game's level design is impressive. Even though there are 2 acts for each zone, the second act always has some sort of difference that makes it very unique from the first one. Take Angel Island Zone for example. You go through a nice foresty level just like the first 2 games, and once you beat it, the zone takes a drastic change. The fact that this game came out only about 2 years after the last one makes this game more impressive. I was seriously blown away seeing this. Every level has some sort of gimmick that you would use to beat it, so every level feels pretty original. In terms of exploration, the only real challenge comes in finding the giant rings for special zones. Just like Sonic Mania, this game's special zones are found within the level in these giant rings. There are multiple of them throughout the levels, so you can get all emeralds pretty quickly if you know where to look. This special zone is probably the most iconic of the 3 games, being the blue spheres. Although base Sonic 3's special zones are pretty normal in terms of difficulty, Sonic and Knuckles' special zones get too hard. Specifically one of them that had me try a bunch of times. Speaking of Sonic and Knuckles, the quality of the levels change a bit. They feel a lot more in-depth and interesting as a result. To get the Chaos Emeralds in and Knuckles, you need all of them from the base game. But when you start the and Knuckles expansion, you have to get them all again. But when you get all emeralds in and Knuckles, you get Hyper Sonic, a more hyper version of Super Sonic. The only difference I felt between the two is Hypersonic feels a lot faster and can do this one super dash when you press jump mid-air. In this game, you'll still see some sparkles appear after hitting a checkpoint, and that's because this game has bonus stages. There are 3 different stages you can do, but they all pretty much give you bonuses like a shield or more rings. You don't really have to do this, but they are there to assist you in levels. There's something really cool about this game, and it's the transitions from one zone to another. Instead of just fading black and moving on to the next zone, most, if not all zones have some sort of transition that shows how Sonic got there. Playing this for the first time blew me away for many reasons. But to say this game is good is such an understatement, especially if you compare it to the games that existed at that time. Now in terms of bosses, this game was pretty unique. Every boss had a gimmick from just chasing after and hitting the boss. The one that sticks out to me the most is in Sandopolis Zone. You fight this golem that comes out of a pyramid, and you can only beat it by pushing it to the quicksand on the other side. Many bosses have these types of gimmicks where you have to do something specific in order to beat it. There are technically 2 final bosses in this game. The first is for Sonic 3, and it's one of Eggman's mechs called Big Arms. It's a pretty boring final boss, but that's mainly because the development team probably already planned out the true final boss in the next version, Sonic and Knuckles. And in this version, the final boss has 2 different answers. The first is Giant Eggman Robo, and you fight this regardless of anything. But if you have all Super Emeralds, you'll fight the final weapon, which you'll be doing in the hypersonic form. It's a pretty cool final boss and actually gives reason to get the emeralds rather than just a special ending. I'm aware that Knuckles and Tails have different final bosses too, but overall, the game is a massive improvement from the other 2 games preceding it. For the last story of today, it's a lot longer than the last 2. Since it's going over 2 entire stories, I'm gonna do my best to say the most important points. It starts off as a continuation from the last game. After the Death Egg crash lands, it lands on a floating island called Angel Island. Eggman meets Knuckles, whose duty is guarding the Chaos Emeralds, and somehow convinces Knuckles that Sonic stole the Chaos Emeralds. Because of this, Knuckles is basically against Sonic throughout the entire game, until the last zone in Sonic and Knuckles. Before that though, Sonic and Tails go to Angel Island because they saw some ancient inscriptions that talked about an old legend. Because Sonic was feeling nostalgic for whatever reason, they head towards Angel Island and Sonic goes supersonic to fly alongside Tails. But when they get there, Knuckles stops him and takes the Chaos Emeralds from him. This intro looks familiar, doesn't it? Eventually, Sonic reaches Eggman in Launch Base Zone, where Eggman has rebuilt the Death Egg and was preparing to launch it back to space. But after Sonic defeats him, the Death Egg falls back and falls into Lava Reef Zone, which then the story continues in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, where Sonic is now trying to get to the Death Egg before Eggman can fix it again. Sonic goes through a bunch of new zones until he gets to the Hidden Palace, where he fights Knuckles, who's protecting the Master Emerald. But after that fight, Eggman steals the Master Emerald, which Knuckles finally connects the dots and asks Sonic for help. Sonic gets transported to Sky Sanctuary, where he fights Mecha Sonic Mark II, and then boards the Death Egg after. He faces off Giant Egg Robo, and once he beats it, Eggman runs off to space where Sonic chases him in his hyper form. Once you defeat him, the Master Emerald returns to Angel Island, which allows it to float once more. However, there's actually more to the story, which is where Knuckles' story comes in. Basically, once that fight happens, Mecha Sonic decides to attack Angel Island and take the Master Emerald. So Knuckles fights against it, and if he has collected all 7 Chaos Emeralds, Knuckles retrieves the Master Emerald from Mecha Sonic. And that restores Angel Island to the island it started off as. I told you this was a long story. The music direction of this game was approached differently. This time, instead of Masato Nakamura making the music, Sega decided to mainly make their music in-house and have some Japanese bands make a portion too. That's pretty much the direction they do nowadays. This was done because royalties started becoming a problem after the success of the first 2 games' music. But at the same time, somehow, they got Michael Jackson to make some music in this game too. But there were even more problems when they had him do it compared to when they had Nakamura compose it. Because during his time there, the allegations he had ended up coming to light and he ended up leaving the project not long after. But it was never confirmed why he left. In fact, Sega never confirms whether he worked on the game or not, typically denying the fact. As a result, any of the songs Michael Jackson had involvement in would be replaced by the prototype versions in later releases. At least, this is all speculation that people more or less deem true. Regardless, I prefer the original music rather than the replaced ones. Carnival Night Zone is one of my favorites, so when I heard the replacement, it was pretty mid. As for what my favorite song is in this game, that easily goes to Angel Island Zone Act 2. In fact, this is the first 2D Sonic game where every act had different music. That's cool. Sorry for making this more of a history lesson than giving my opinion on the music. The 3 Sonic games have really exceeded my expectations. While I played through them, I've noticed how every game got better. It's pretty typical for the sequels to look and play better than the last game, but with how little development time these games got and what the end results were, I'm pretty impressed. Sonic 2 and 3 both have a multiplayer option. In Sonic 2's case, it's more of a race throughout the zones. It has different music from the zones you play, and you can only play 3 zones plus the special zone to begin with. You can also use items to affect the gameplay. Sonic 3 on the other hand is quite different. First of all levels are really short, needing you to do 5 laps around the stage. Second of all, levels are all unique to this mode with their own music as well. You can also get items here to affect the outcome. There are actually 3 different options you can choose in this mode. Grand Prix, where you play through all the levels consecutively, Match Race, where you do a quick race in the chosen stage, and Time Attack, where you play solo in a stage. In fact, you can play any of these modes solo, so you don't have to worry about finding a second player to try it out. Something I realized while playing Sonic 3 was how much it played like Sonic Mania. If anything, Sonic Mania is just a definitive version of 3 and Knuckles. These classic games did get many re-releases over the years. For some reason, Sonic 1, 2, and CD all got mobile ports, and if I'm not mistaken, Sonic 3 was also supposed to get one, but the team who made the ports went on to make Sonic Mania instead. At least that's how I think it went. Speaking of Sonic 3, this was the least re-released game of the 3. I'm not really sure why, but apparently, the versions in Origins, which is the version I played through, is among the worst. Although for the most part it played fine, there were parts that were a bit buggy. And the times that this game does get re-released, the replacement songs are used instead of the originals. I do hope more classic pre-adventure era games get re-released in the future though. Playing these games were a pretty cool experience, and I can understand why Sonic became popular a bit better than before. Even though I was the one going over these games, where would you put them on the tier list? Oh yeah, the tier list. I kinda forgot about that. I more or less agree with Eeb 2 on his opinions of these games. To start off, I'll put Sonic 1 in C tier. The only real zone I enjoyed in that game was Green Hill, and the game got pretty repetitive and annoying fast. But given that it was the first game, I can't really be too hard on it. Sonic 2 on the other hand gets an A tier. This was the first Sonic game I've played since it was free for the mobile port, and it was free for a little while on the Sega Mega Drive Classic Collection on Steam. I do have a lot of fond memories of this game, but I didn't remember it being this easy. It felt more or less like an improved Sonic 1, but with a bit more variety in its gameplay. Also, the special zones are a lot more fun. I'd even say they're the best of the 3. And finally, to maybe no one's surprise, Sonic 3 goes in S tier. That goes for the Knuckles expansion too, since it's adding on to the base game. The first time I ever played this game, I was immensely blown away. For a Mega Drive game, I was not expecting cutscenes. I know the first cutscene happens, but the zone transitions, the act changes, and the story cutscenes that happen throughout the games were things I did not think was gonna happen. It was a much bigger game than I thought, and I would easily recommend the game. However, it isn't actually my favorite of the classics. That you'll find out soon. For the most part, I do agree with you on where you put these games. They are pretty interesting, even more than the Super Mario Bros. Trilogy, I'd say. I didn't know probably half the stuff that I talked about in this video, so I'm kinda glad I played these games. I know, right? I may not be the biggest Sonic fan in the world, but I gotta admit, this franchise is always so interesting to me. In a funny way, it's like he's cursed to be second, even though he has a very passionate fan base. Almost too passionate. Huh? Nothing? Anyways, I guess I'll go get ready to talk about Sonic CD soon.